I am thrilled to be sitting here talking with you, Justin Baldoni, for many reasons.
Thank you,
Um,
Jane Randall.
there are many, many accomplishments that you've had, whether it's acting or an author, podcasting, an activist, honestly. I mean, that's really, if you really, they don't have an EGOT for that, right? You don't have all that, but you should have one for all of those things. You need to work on
Or
that.
uh, or maybe there should be like the award given to the person who is having his trauma response of wanting to be liked and loved lead his career.
I think it'd be a lot of competition, no offense. So I had the privilege of being in the audience for your TED Talk in New Orleans.
I
Um,
remember.
yep. And I, while I really enjoyed it. I had been to TED Global once, but this was TED Women, and I really enjoyed it. But your talk, sorry, everybody else who spoke, your talk blew everybody away
Hmm.
because they're not used to someone like you being so vulnerable and real. Um, and that was just new for an audience of people who I think see themselves as very open and aware. And I think this was a totally new thing for them. But that was not the beginning of your journey, clearly. Um, your journey to redefine masculinity for yourself, perhaps, but really for the world and help everybody realize what it means to be a man. So can
Hmm.
you talk to me a little bit about how you got started on, down this path, the TED Talk, what that represented to you and where it's taken you so far?
First of all, thank you, Jane, and thank you for your incredible work and your activism and building No More and what it's doing for survivors around the world. I think I should be interviewing you. However, um, we can do that. We'll do that later.
Next time.
Uh, um, you know, this was really this was a very personal journey that accidentally became public.
Mm,
I guess that's how I would say it.
well,
And then once it accidentally became public, um, meaning like once I shared a little bit and there was this clear desire for me to share more,
mhm,
um, there was this like dual process of me doing the work privately while talking about it with like this slight delay publicly.
mhm,
And then there were times when like the latency wasn't long enough and I was really healing in real time and talking about it in real time.
yeah,
Um, and it felt very messy and there were times where I felt very insincere because I didn't feel like I had the right to be sharing or talking about some of the things that I was sharing and talking about because I was, again, like we're talking about a 2 or 3 second delay.
right.
I might be, I learn, I'm uncovering and I'm learning something, and then 2 months later I'm talking about it, and that doesn't feel like long enough to really be sitting in it and with it. And I can see that now, 8 years in to this work
Right.
and five
Right.
years from the TED Talk, that there were times when it was really messy and I felt like a hypocrite. And yet it was valuable and important for me and healing for me to be on this very public journey while on it in private. And
Right.
also,
Right.
and really, in some ways, it was just knowing how deeply I was hurting and how many men like me were hurting, and then
Right.
how many women and gender nonconforming and trans folks were also hurting
Yep.
because the men were hurting. And it was, and again, I don't want to. I don't, it's not like, oh, I felt this responsibility, but what I felt was like, God, I wish there would have been someone in my position
Yep.
who could have like led the way and just made me feel less alone.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
that was that's why I decided to keep going. And
mhm.
the truth is, I tried to get out of that TED Talk multiple times. Uh, Pat Mitchell is a force to be reckoned with.
She sure is.
She would not let me out.
Uh-huh. She knows what
um,
she's doing.
she knows what she's doing, and same with my friend Mina over at TED. I really did try to get out. I also tried to get out of my book. I, tr-
You did?
and what I found is that when I'm walking that tightrope, when I'm like walking along the razor's edge of just being so open and vulnerable, in
Mhm.
a public way, it is the most terrifying thing for me.
Mhm.
And yet that's also where I feel like I'm called to live a part of my life.
Mhm.
Um, so I get to this point, I'm like about to jump out of the plane, and I'm like, I can't jump out of the plane.
Right,
I can't,
right.
I can't go speak at TED Women. You know what, Pat? Why don't you give my spot to a woman? Maybe that would be better, you know? No, no, this is the whole point, Justin. And
Yes.
and so that's the journey I've been on. And 5 years from that TED Talk, so much has changed. So much has changed culturally.
Mhm.
Um, the conversation has changed. It's so much more open. There are a lot more men talking about this, and there's also a lot more of an antagonistic approach to the conversation that has started to circulate, of course, as we know.
Yes.
Uh, so that's a long-winded answer to your very simple question. It was a very
I know.
public,
I
private
think it's,
journey that I felt like I had to take.
I have three boys. I have
Hmm.
a 21-year-old and twin 19-year-olds. And I'll just say on their behalf, they have all, and their father, that vulnerability, having that vulnerability was never an issue in the family, right? Everyone, no one had to pretend to be super macho,
That's
which
so
was nice.
cool.
Um, what is interesting, and this is not just about me. What is interesting though, is as their mom watching, you get nervous for them because of the very things that you were just talking about, right? Because I love the fact that they're open and vulnerable, but I don't know how other people, kids, teens, are going to react.
Yeah,
And also, you know, as a parent, the worst hurt in the world is if someone hurts your kid, right? Or
yeah,
if your kid is hurting, right? I mean, that's just the
yeah.
worst. So I, I, it's why I really appreciated the book and and one of the things about the book, while it's written for, what's the age range exactly that you sort of wrote it for?
It's written as 11 to 100.
Mhm.
That's my joke, is that you're never too old to read this book. I recently reread it, and it was really healing and good for me. I wrote it in a way, it was written to like my 11-year-old boy
Mhm.
inside me, who oftentimes is in the driver's seat,
Yeah,
who
sure.
I've been learning to talk to and to hold in a way that he was never held. And so yeah, it's for 11, 12, 13-year olds. And of course, what I tell the parents is not every 11-year-old is going to be ready for the book. Specifically, there's a chapter on sex
Mhm.
and porn and consent and social media and these types of things. And depending on the parenting style and where that 11-year-old really is, and who that 11-year-old is surrounded by, that he might be too young.
Correct.
But chances are by 12 or 13, he's going to be exposed to the things that I talk about in the book. And I believe that as parents, we should take more of a proactive approach so
100%.
that we're preparing our children for what's to come, specifically as it relates to your work and no more, versus having this kind of defensive rebound.
Couldn't
Let,
agree more.
let me respond to the situation. And because by that point, we're too late. All those neural pathways have already been carved the first time that they've seen some of these images or been exposed to some of the things. So I say 11 to 100 because you're never too old, and 11 seems like it's the right age.
I sort of like you with my oldest. I'm the youngest of three girls. So I knew about sex at a young age, sort of because I have these two older sisters. But
Yeah.
my oldest, I made sure to tell him sort of, not, I mean, sort of just tell him about a little bit about the birds and the bees when he was in third grade, right? Because I just didn't want him, I wanted him to hear it from us, as
Yeah.
opposed to, I mean, obviously a simplified third grade version, but opposed to somebody who has an older sibling, right? And then they hear this other version.
Jane, I'm curious. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question because I have to, because of what you do and your amazing work. When did you first bring up the word consent to your boys?
I would show them videos. I would talk to them pretty early.
Hmm.
Now, what I'll tell you is that what I didn't realize about the word consent is the breadth of it. So when we talk about consent in this context, we think about sex, right? Consenting, consent, but there's so much more. Like, so for
Yeah,
littler kids, it's a, it's learning boundaries and
physical
respect.
boundaries. Yep.
Exactly. And, when to touch somebody. I don't mean touch them sexually. I just mean when to touch, when not to touch, when they can say, I don't want to hug grandma, or don't make me, kiss Aunt Rose, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um, and letting kids understand what they deserve in relationships.
I realized a similar thing on accident, like you. as we were teaching our kids about boundaries, and even like with my daughter and son and touching each other, and like my son loves to hit me in the balls for some
Sure.
reason. I have no idea why.
It's apparently a
He's
little
five.
boy thing. I mean, I can't really, yeah.
And and then they'll start to do certain things, and explaining consent to a kid in that way, I went, oh my God, we're already
Yes,
starting. We're
yes.
laying the groundwork for when it's okay, when it feels like it's okay, when you can touch somebody, when you can't, what no means.
Hmm.
The first time I explained, because my kids were fighting and my son was saying no, 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 and my daughter wasn't listening. So explaining to my daughter
Sure.
what no means as an aggressor to her little brother was like, oh my God, this is where it starts. And I don't know if anyone ever explained it to me like that when I was a little boy.
And what it does is it sets you up to have healthy relationships throughout your entire life, right?
Hmm.
If you can learn as a child to set these boundaries and understand what you want for yourself and respect other people's boundaries, then you can, sort of go forward in in any relationship, whether it's, dating or platonic or what
And
have you.
and this is where the porn conversation comes in, of course, because but then when you hit 11 or 12 and your friends have a phone and maybe you don't, and you're being shown things on the phone for the first time, and that's cool, and then you start to think that that is what women want, and
Correct.
porn, as we know, no means yes or try harder, right? Quoting our good friend Ted Bunch at A Call to Men.
Correct.
Um, it starts to become very confusing, which is definitely something that happened to me.
Yeah.
I'm sure I have crossed boundaries and lines in my teens and 20s, not even thinking about it, simply
Of
because of
course.
the porn I was consuming.
That's
You
so
are
interesting.
what you consume. That it's that simple. And so many men, so many of us men, I would argue that in the high 90s, are consuming it on a daily or weekly basis, and that is absolutely influencing the way that they see the world, the way that they see their relationships, and the way that they view women as objects and not people.
Parents need to have a conversation with their kids that porn is not real. And what they're seeing is not a consensual relationship between two people. It's fantasy. It's not the way relationships work. And
Of-
I think until they can have that conversation and acknowledge that their kids are seeing porn, because that's really hard for people, for parents to understand that their kids are actually seeing it, take
Yeah.
that conversation. And that will actually get you right into the consent conversation, right? I mean, it's a total launching point.
And going back to the book, that is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because it is as a parent to a little boy, a little girl, and my little girl is quickly approaching the age of this book. I know and I can empathize with how hard it is to take that step, because in some way that's the end of you having a little kid.
Hmm. Yep.
There's something I think about the Western view on sexuality,
Hmm.
where when that conversation is had, you no longer have a little kid anymore.
Hmm.
And then in some ways, you're mourning that. You're
Hmm.
mourning the time that's gone by and that you'll never have that be a little kid anymore. And so I think we delay these conversations,
Hmm.
not for the kid, but for ourselves. And this is why I have so much empathy for other parents, because I don't want my kid to grow up. It's one of the things that I torture myself about all the time. Is like, my God, I'm never going to get this time back. And I miss so much of it. And you kind of like, my favorite quote that I learned before I became a parent was being a parent is the only time you feel nostalgia in the present.
That's
You're
really
literally
nice.
missing and holding on to this moment that's nostalgic while it's happening, because it's just going to go. It's elusive.
Yeah.
So we delay, and then it's too late, and somebody else teaches our children about sex or sexuality or porn, and it comes into their lives in a way that to me is akin to sexual assault. That
Hmm.
when I viewed porn at 10 years old, it absolutely was an assault on my brain and my body.
Sure.
To this day, I struggle with the comparison that I experienced long before I hit puberty, what I saw, and if I was going to ever measure up to it, if I was ever going to be the thing that I saw that I was, and I didn't ask to be introduced to it. It was given to me. It was shown to me.
Of
And at
course.
that point, you're flooded with so many chemicals and hormones in your body that of course you're curious and you want to see more, because we're hardwired for it.
Yep. Yep.
But what it does is irreparable. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, so that a parent can read this, remember all of the things, remember and maybe do some of the inventory of what happened to them in their life, and then say, let's read it together, and then let's have a conversation about it. Because if a parent, like, here's an example. I recently had my dad on my podcast,
Mhm.
and I hadn't talked to him after he read my first book, Man Enough. So we had the conversation on this podcast. And I had no idea that my dad was also introduced to porn when he was 10 years old by a family. And he told me this really weird, effed up story on the podcast that if he would have told to me when I was 11, it would have helped me so much.
Right.
It would have healed me, and I probably wouldn't have developed a porn addiction in my teens.
Mm-hmm.
Because I would have known that my dad had this happen to him, that my dad struggled with it, and he could have talked to me about it, and then it would have gotten rid of the like shame and the secrecy and a lot of what fuels addiction.
Right.
All he had to do was talk to me about it, but he didn't know how,
Right.
because he hadn't done that inventory on himself, and that's not his fault. He was from a different generation. So this generation, our generation, we have an opportunity to be proactive in the development of our children's lives and help them explore and learn what healthy sexuality is, what healthy boundaries are, what consent actually means,
Right.
so that we can avoid what is inevitably going to happen to so many women and girls, or in my case, even me, because I didn't know what consent was, and I was taken advantage of at an age.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, to just become a companion for parents.
It's interesting what you just said about your dad. You know, he didn't know how to be vulnerable to you, right? It's a matter of being willing to be vulnerable. Um, you might not have seen it if he talked to you when you were 10 about it as vulnerable, but he felt it as being very vulnerable, right? And so it's interesting because it's sort of, there's a few things I underlined and really liked in the book, and this undefining masculinity and how real boys feel. I mean, that's really what this whole thing is encapsulated in this, this idea of what masculinity is. And what really struck me when I read the book was, yes, it's very important for parents to read with their boys, but there are elements of it, a lot of it, that's really important for people who identify as female to understand as well,
Yeah.
because I'm socialized the same way, right? I'm socialized to expect you to be a real man, whatever that means. My college boyfriend went into the Marines and was offered a candidate school. And I finally saw him after the first 6 weeks, and he, was a pretty big, tough guy, um, like very gentle, but big, tough guy. And he just, when I saw him, they sort of broke him down, and he just sat and sobbed in my arms when I first saw him,
Mm,
and I felt so uncomfortable.
of
Like
course.
instead of feeling sympathetic, I just like I did. I was sympathetic. I felt, but I also felt really uncomfortable because that's not what happens.
You were
So I
socialized to believe that you can cry and he holds you.
correct.
And look, bell hooks writes about this in A Will to Change, right?
Hmm.
Name the word for that is internalized female misogyny.
Hmm. For sure.
The unwritten expectation that women raised in a patriarchal system have on their men.
Yep.
Glennon Doyle writes about a very similar story in Untamed, right? In the boys chapter,
Hmm.
where her friend calls her and she's like, I don't know what to do. My husband was super vulnerable with me and he was crying and I was like disgusted. And this is like a feminist.
Yeah.
And she's like, what's happening to me? There's like this divergence in our brain. Our like neural programming is like cognitive. It's like, wait, but I believe in equality and I want men to be vulnerable, but then second they are, we punish them.
Yeah.
And
No,
this is
it's
a phenomenon that a lot of men are experiencing right now, which is I believe also driving a lot of this like the antagonistic conversation around modern masculinity, because
hmm
a lot of men feel like there's no winning. They feel like, well, if I'm vulnerable, then they don't like me. I'm punished. And I think this is where women, or women identifying people, have to really take account on their
Yep.
own. I can't do that. I have to do my work as a man.
Yeah.
But from women that I have been talking to, there is definitely a need for us to kind of have a awakening there and be like, oh, wait, oh, I'm also I'm also a
Yes,
byproduct of the same system, which is honestly one of the best things that has ever happened to my marriage was my wife reading my book.
really.
Two things happen. One of them I wrote about at the end of the book, which was she finishes it and she says to me, "This is really good, baby, but now you need to read it."
I knew I liked
And
her.
and I was like, "Oh, that's too good. I'm putting it in the book." I could not because the whole book was an exercise of vulnerability. So of course I put that in the book. The
Right.
second thing that happened, which she told me later, was that she realized that I was also suffering, and she thought she was the only one that was suffering in the system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I found so many women talking about, oh wow, I was abused or I was molested or I was in an abusive relationship, and I have never been able to have compassion for men until now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because in some ways, when a man opens up about what life has been like for him, the reality of it, not the like facade, the
Right.
mirage,
Right.
uh, how do you not have compassion? Because we're all human beings, right? And if
Right.
feminism is the radical notion that women are people, um, then I think we have to also look at what equality is and what the goal of feminism is, as an example. The way that I would define equality um, would be that we are striving not for sameness,
Mm-hmm.
but for equality in a system that does not punish anybody simply because they are one gender or a race.
Yep.
Um, I think we have to. I think we have to find a way to embrace the biological beauty
Mm-hmm.
and that we were created with, um, and not hold that against one another. So I think so often, especially when I've heard like, there's so many wars on modern feminism, um, uh, and so many different opinions of what it even means anymore. And at
Right.
the end of the day, who the hell am I to talk about feminism? I'm a man. To me, I just think we have to be mindful that we're not striving for sameness. I don't want to be the same as a woman. I just want to be treated the same, and I want her to be treated the same as me.
Correct.
And more than anything, I don't want her to ever not have an opportunity simply because of her gender.
Correct.
And
And
to me,
that's
that's
why I
to me
loved
that's
it.
equality.
There's one story, it's in the early on in the book that really resonated with me, which is the story of the bridge.
Mm,
Um, and it resonated with me because I think, I guess again, as a woman reading it and not reading it to read it to my kid, but reading it, there was a lot I could relate to too, because there's different facades we all put on.
yeah.
But this story of the bridge was, I mean, you don't, if you can just tell it quickly, however, but it was so, to me, it was very impactful.
The story of the bridge, I think, can be summarized as an exercise in what we define as brave. Culturally, at least in the West, um, brave seems to be synonymous with like fearless. Um, we consider certain jobs brave,
Hmm.
firefighters running into a burning building.
Right.
Uh, uh, we consider police officers brave. We consider, bomb squad vets, folks that go fight
Yep.
wars.
Yep.
And I think that definition is limiting because I think that being emotionally brave is one of the most challenging things that a human can do, let alone a man with the programming that we have, that we've had socially. I start the book this way because I was, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old, and we were all, my friends, we had a little river, and they were jumping off the bridge, and it was like, I don't know, 15, 20 feet high.
Hi.
And it's pretty darn high. And I'm
Yeah, that's
somebody who's
fine.
afraid of heights. And there's like, I don't know, a 6 foot gap where you can not kill yourself into this deep water. And, and the guys would jump and it was exciting. And I couldn't get myself to jump. And I learned I was afraid of heights. And yet I felt pressure too. And, thinking back on that experience as an adult, what I learned was that while I did jump, I jumped for the wrong reasons. And I taught my body in that moment that I was supposed to override it and that the feelings that were coming up for me, the fear that was coming up for me, um, were not allowed to come up. I was teaching myself, I was teaching my body that those feelings were bad,
Mhm.
that those emotions, that fear were going to put me at risk to being bullied and policed and made fun of. And of
Mhm.
course, in that same moment, while all those things are coming up, the worst thing that I could be called is a girl,
Mhm.
because the worst thing that a young boy can be called is the opposite gender.
Mhm.
Um, and well, I want to be a girl. Back then, that was an insult.
Sure.
And like, so literally being called the opposite sex made me jump off a bridge.
Right.
Now, when I landed, I felt amazing because I had adrenaline. I was alive. I didn't die. um,
Conquered fear.
and I had the acceptance of my peers, and it fooled me
Mhm.
into thinking that, oh, this was an acceptable thing. This is good. And if you look at like the all of the things that had to line up perfectly for me to jump, they're all really problematic things that stay with me and stay with young boys throughout the course of their lives. Having to ignore and suppress their feelings and emotions,
Mhm.
being called a girl or gay, right?
Mhm.
So talking
Yep.
about like misogyny and homophobia, and having
Mhm.
that be something that makes you jump. And then, of course, being accepted by your peers after you then uh, after you then don't listen to your body and you jump.
Right. Right.
So in hindsight, and the reason I read about it is because there's nothing wrong with jumping off the bridge. But what I want young boys to start doing is listening to their bodies. And I want them to start to learn what emotional bravery is, because it is just as brave to say, no,
Right.
I'm afraid of heights, I'm not going to jump, as it would be to jump. And at the same time, I think it's also important that we learn how to push ourselves and skate on the edge in certain situations. But that has to be something that we listen to. Like we have to be aware of the feeling. And the more that we start to bury and numb those feelings, as simple as that sounds, that moment on the bridge where I just suppressed my feelings and emotions, well, I'm teaching myself that that
Yep.
is how I'm going to survive. And that's how I'm going to be liked. So that means when feelings and emotions come up in my life, I'm just going to have a natural tendency to suppress them
Yeah.
versus to allow myself to feel them. Now, had I allowed myself to feel the fear, honored the fact that I was afraid, spoken it out loud without fear of being called the girl, because what I say also in the book is that being truly emotionally brave would I would know that being called a girl is not an insult.
Right.
Had I let those things sink in and then made the conscious choice to jump anyways, no
Mhm.
problem.
Right.
The
Right.
problem is when I don't allow those things to come up, so that I can look at them to see if this is right for me. Because
Right.
that same situation, you know, you can put a boy in a situation where he's at a party and he's drinking, and all of his friends are saying, "Hey, she's drunk," and he has a conflicting feeling because he knows it's wrong, and
Yep.
yet he jumped off the bridge 100 times in the last 5 years. So he doesn't even have the ability to actually check in with his body to know that it's wrong, that he
Right.
shouldn't take advantage of the girl. So
Right.
again, we're just teaching our boys the wrong things through socialization. And all I'm asking young boys to do is to be okay to listen to their bodies, to check in with themselves, to feel the feelings that are coming up for them, because they're coming up for a reason. And then once
Mhm.
they come up, once they're aware of them, they can choose what to do.
Sure.
If they want to jump, jump. But it's
Right.
just as brave to not jump.
I actually think it's braver for a young kid
That's what I
to
write in the book, is that
no.
it's just as, if not more brave,
Yep.
to not jump off that bridge and risk being called the names that could hurt and risk being made fun of, because you're honoring your feelings and you're teaching yourself that you matter, that your feelings matter, that you are enough, and that your worth is not determined by external validation.
Right. So I want to be respectful of your time. Um, and I have two questions for you.
No
One
problem.
is to just talk a little bit about how this journey has entered into your work life. So you have the podcast, you have another book, Man Enough, and the podcast, and Wayfarer. And so how do you tie all this together in those ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's no real roadmap. There's no real way that these things are all tied together. Obviously, I'm the common denominator.
Hmm.
Um, and what I feel is that this conversation is just really important. And what I'm trying to do in my life is model it the best that I can, and I fall short all the time. Just thinking about my company, the other day there was a situation where I found myself on multiple occasions talking over and interrupting a particular woman on my team.
Mhm.
And I noticed it in the moment, but then I was like, okay, but it's Zoom, were we just bantering? And then it happened again. And I realized, oh, wait, no, this is a pattern with this particular person, and that's not okay. Why am I doing this?
Mhm.
Um, and so so I got everybody together that was on the call where this particular thing happened. Um, and I I I apologized in front of everybody else, and I said, I'm so sorry. Like that was not okay of me. And I was in my own stuff, and I was interrupting, and I even think I mansplained something to her because I think we were talking about a woman's issue. I think that's one of the things that I've learned in the last, you know, decade is I am never going to be perfect. And the work that I'm doing to deprogram and unlearn so many of the things that I've learned through socialization over the almost 40 years of my life, it's not overnight that this stuff happens.
Mhm.
And what's really hard and what I've noticed is that when I make a mistake, um, because I'm so public with this, it can have double the impact
Sure.
because it can almost feel like, oh wow, is he full of shit? And the
Yeah.
reality is no, but I'm human.
Right, right.
And so when you ask me like how this is all working together, I think that's where I wanted to go with this is it's working imperfectly and yet perfectly
Mhm.
because I get a chance in a daily life to practice what I preach. And I do tons of work, and I'm so deep into my own healing journey. And sometimes stuff will come up and it's messy, and I and the journey doesn't look beautiful, and I'm not the guy that did the TED talk. I'm in a bad mood or I'm struggling,
Yeah.
and I get the chance to model what I talk about in the book, and I have to go back if I'm not the first person to go back and apologize and lead by example and say, God, you guys, I'm so sorry. I've been in this haze and I've been negative or I interrupted you. I'm so sorry. If I can't do that, then I'm literally a walking hypocrite. So that's the way that's my only answer I have to your question right now is that I'm trying to integrate my work in everything that I do, and that it's not always perfect. And I also want to make room for all the men that are trying and feel like they're failing. I had a young man who came to I did an event in New York last week, and Ted Bunch was my moderator.
Yeah.
And this young man sat in the front row, and he was so brave and vulnerable. And he said, "Hey, I have a question. Sometimes I feel like I want to be a better man, and yet I will fall victim to some of the behaviors that I've been socialized with, and it makes me not want to talk about it. It makes me want to give up." And so I gave him a similar story as an example, and I said, "We cannot let our drive for perfection get in the way of our progress. And we have to also remember that that perfection is a privilege.
Mhm.
And that perfection also is deeply rooted in masculinity and the need to be perfect, the need to have our shit together and to look like we're great versus to be willing to be vulnerable and go on a messy journey. And I
Mhm.
think that's really important for men to hear that you're not just going to wake up overnight
Yeah.
and like stop interrupting because you've been doing it for 30 years
Right.
or 25 years. But what you can do is acknowledge, be close enough to the women in your life where they tell you,
Yep.
hey, you've been interrupting me, not take it personally, and then try to change.
Yep.
That is the only thing that I think that we can do as men is be working on ourselves and be holding ourselves accountable.
Well, one of my favorite expressions is the perfect is the enemy of the good. And you basically just said that. And I was going to ask you, what's the one thing you want people to take away from our conversation today? But I think I don't know how you would distill it down to one thing, frankly. So I'm not even going to ask you that question. Um, but I am
Yeah.
going to, yeah, right? Like, what's the one thing?
Well, I got it. Feel your feelings.
Beautiful.
Start there. Like you can distill it down to like feel your feelings.
Yep. I think that's a beautiful thing. And we will end on that note. Justin, thank you so much for taking the
Oh,
time.
Jay.
You're so
So
busy. I
lovely
mean,
always
between
talking to you.
between your work and your books and the children's book. I mean, that's I sort of giggled when you said you had a children's book coming out. I'm like, really? Like, when do you
It
need
was
to?
written. It was written a while ago, and it's not a gender specific book. It was written a while ago. That's kind of like the last of the in this same family.
Okay,
But
right.
I'm excited for the work we're going to do together, Jane, and
Yeah,
No More and Wayfair
really.
Studios. And
Thank you. Shout out to one of our board members who works for you, Brian Singer.
yeah, Brian
Um,
Singer, the
he's the best.
best.
You're like downplaying this book, but like you've written 3 and I've written none. So I feel like you don't downplay that. It's pretty impressive. Thank you for taking the time. Obviously, you're busy, and I know you have other stuff going on. So really, really, really appreciate
Oh,
it.
it was such an honor. Always, anything you ask, I'll do it. I appreciate all the work you guys do over there. It's so
Hope
important.
this is the first of many conversations.
Many.
All right. Thanks, Justin.
All right.